I'm here to introduce Mike Goldstein. I want to introduce you to Mike from the board's perspective, and it truly is a caring family involvement. I met Mike about 5 years ago when I joined the board, and at that time, other than that he sat at the head of the table, and he ran a pretty efficient meeting, I didn't know anything about him. I've come to know over the years that in total, Mike served more than 23 years on our board, 3 years as chair. I know that the unparalleled knowledge of higher education law that he brought to our board is absolutely irreplaceable. His wisdom, wit, and courage guided us through good times and bad, always reminding us to stay true to our values. Words cannot express how much I have come to respect Mike's vast knowledge of higher education, to appreciate his sage advice, and to value his warm friendship. It is truly my great honor to introduce him to you today.
Michael B. Goldstein, the honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, with all the honors, rights, and privileges thereto appertaining. Whereas, as a pioneer in the development of the legal environment in higher education to improve the ability of the sector to deliver quality education. Whereas, as a leader in championing creative approaches to education, which has expanded learning opportunities for all. Whereas, as a counselor at the highest levels of legislation, including accreditation, and notably the State Authorization Reciprocity Act, which are all efforts to support an innovative sector. Whereas, as an advisor to educational associations, such as the American Association of Community Colleges, that supports education, particularly for communities that are traditionally underserved. Whereas, as a scholar leader in your own right, in your own profession, writing on critical issues facing higher education in America today. Whereas, as a trustee for Fielding Graduate University, which has benefited greatly from your wisdom and guidance. Whereas, your impact on higher education is substantial and will be felt far into the future. Therefore, be it resolved that Fielding Graduate University honors you with its highest honor, the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, as one who champions the highest ideals of learning as a means towards a more just and sustainable future for humanity.
As a lawyer, I must assume that with all those wonderful words, the print is very small. I want to thank the faculty, President Rogers, and the entire Board of Trustees, and of course, Chair Honorary, for bestowing upon me this Fielding degree. My doctorate is qualified by the words honoris causa, literally for the sake of honor, not achieved in the ordinary course. I know what it takes to secure a Fielding doctorate in the ordinary course, and I'm honored to be sharing this platform with each of you who has successfully stayed that course. I want to speak with you today about a fundamental question. Why does an idea that has been around for decades suddenly seem to leap into the public discourse? How does a practice or concept, long considered at best marginal, and by many problematic, become recognized as a solution? What makes something the next big thing? Now, I suggest this is a particularly important conversation to have with this particular audience, and I'm specifically now addressing our graduates. I'm not standing before a group of newly minted PhDs and EDDs who are about to embark on their professional and academic careers. Men and women who we hope are destined to become leaders. Rather, I have the privilege of appearing in this silly hat and quite preposterous robe before an audience very much my peers, men and women who are leaders, who are change makers, who will leave these hallowed halls of the Weston O'Hare and step back into positions of influence around the nation and around the world. Identifying what is coming down the road and separating what is important from what is not is particularly significant for you who are today's thought leaders and change makers. I'm going to focus on something which everyone who is part of the fielding community has a visceral sense: competency-based learning. From its inception 4 decades ago, which is even longer than I've been a member of this board, the institution's learning model has been based not on time on task, but on mastering competencies. The 4 founders of fielding, it's a nice phrase, believed that the model they were creating would serve the intellectual needs of mid-career professionals far better than conventional classroom training. They were, of course, correct, and you are living proof of that fact. You might have observed that I do not use the term competency-based education. That's quite intentional. Instead, I refer to what goes on in fielding and what I think we're really talking about as competency-based learning. The difference is not semantic. Education is delivered to a student. It is received. Learning is secured by a student. It is found. It is captured. That is the essence of what we do at fielding, and that's what makes this approach to learning so important. For 40 years, competency-based learning was in the shadows. Suddenly, it's in the spotlight. What happened? And this is really the thrust of my remarks. We need a different term to make sense of what has happened. And I think there are 2 terms that apply to this. One is convergence, and the other, with a tip of the tam to Clay Christensen, one of the really great contemporary minds in education change, is disruptive innovation. Now, I know my reference to disruptive innovation in the context of CBL may seem strange. After all, disruption disrupts. It's sort of like an earthquake. You know, it shakes the foundations. And it's hard to apply that to something that's been sort of incubated for 40 years. But I think the analogy is actually very, very strong. Earthquakes don't just happen. An earthquake is the result of years, ages, eons of increasing force that ultimately reaches a certain point where it snaps, where it lets go. There are societal demands that have arisen in the second decade of the 21st century that are really shaking higher education to its roots. And they're kind of flipped terms. Faster, cheaper, better. How often have we heard politicians say, we've got to make education faster, cheaper, better? In the context of education, I think it's fair to say that in the 20s, faster was rendered obsolete with the adoption of the credit hour. And since then, American higher education has been lashed to a time and place system. A course was and remains denominated in credit hours, generally an hour, or the 50-minute equivalent of an hour, in a classroom or lecture hall with a couple hundred of your closest friends, and 2 hours of expected out-of-class study, and that will equal 1 credit. Accumulate a certain number of these, let's say 120, and you get a bachelor's degree. Now, from an accountant's perspective, and particularly from the perspective of those who need to figure out how to allocate funds to charge for and support student learning, this is a brilliant idea. A great way to manage a finance department. Not so great for making learning happen. Well, what if we changed that? What if we said that what we're really going to measure is what a student knows? And what we're really going to do is we're going to decide what a student needs to know, what competencies a student needs to have in order to be considered competent in a certain field, in order to be granted a piece of paper that says you are a competent X, and maybe you are competent as a bachelor in economics, or a bachelor in English, or a doctor in human and organization development. What goes into that? So that's change number 1. Change number 2. Most students who come to higher education at any level actually have minds and actually have had experiences and actually have knowledge. What if we measured what a student came into the educational system and said, that's where we're setting the baseline for this student. The knowledge required is here. We're not assuming the student is here, which is what we do today. We're saying the student is somewhere above here, but not there. Now, we've developed 2 very, very good systems for doing that, and they are the triad of competency-based learning, and that's direct assessment and prior learning assessment. We either directly assess what a student knows, or we look at what a student has done and infer from that what a student should know. That leaves a gap. Then you fill that gap by exposing the student to the mixture of learning opportunities that allow the student at the end of the day to have those competencies. That's what we do at Fielding. That's what we've done at Fielding for 40 years. There's always going to be, in MIT, there's always going to be a Swarthmore. But for a vast majority of learners, what we really need is 1,000 Fieldings. So the question is, what's the solution for what ails this system, what in fact blocks there being 1,000 Fieldings? And I have a suggestion. The suggestion is not that we abolish the existing system or even change the existing accreditors. And certainly not that we get the federal government involved in overseeing education in any respect. I think we have plenty of experience what a bad idea that is. But there is a way to make change, and we get an example of this a dozen or so years ago. It was Western Governors University was being organized, and I was on the design team for Western Governors. And it overlapped 3 accrediting regions, the Western region, the Northwest region, and what was then the North Central region, now the Higher Learning Commission. And they looked at what Western Governors was doing was a model which is comparable, different but comparable to Fielding. And they said, this is really interesting, but it just doesn't fit our standards. Now, fortunately for us, not fortunately for them, they made that comment while sitting in the office of Governor Roy Romer with Governor Mike Levitt, who were the co-chairs of the Board of Trustees of Western Governors University. And the governors were not amused by that response. This was, after all, an institution that they and their brethren created. And to the credit of the accreditors, they were able to see impending death. And they put together a special group, the Interregional Accrediting Council, composed of representatives of the 3 accrediting bodies, and they found a way to specially accredit Western governors. To say, we're not going to use our standards, we're not going to use our models, we're going to look at your model, and we're going to figure out how to determine whether, in fact, you're providing suitable quality of education. Now, that idea worked, but then it went into hibernation. And the reason it went into hibernation was what I said before. The earthquake had not struck. There was no pressure to make change. Western governors was a nice idea, but others were not rushing to implement it. Nobody was pounding down the doors of the accreditors. Now that change is occurring. And what I suggest is that we create an overarching accrediting body for competency-based learning. And an institution can choose to be reviewed by that body, and that body is created by the existing regional accreditors, and they agree that if an institution passes muster, or a program passes muster through that body, it will meet their accreditation standards. Now, that's a way to preserve the existing system, which for the vast majority of institutions more or less works, notwithstanding all of the noise. But it allows what is the future of higher education to develop on its own, and not to develop in a situation where what we do has to be hammered into the iron mold of the existing accreditation model. What you have experienced should be the norm for higher education, indeed for education generally. While the disruptive innovation has appeared, its application remains constrained by a regulatory environment that is inherently resistant to change. We therefore must look beyond the current methods of assessing institutional quality, which still largely looks at what goes on inside the college, and go to a system that starts by determining what competencies define a certain learning outcome, how those competencies relate to what the individual needs in the real world, and end with a process that documents those competencies in an evidence-based manner. In between, the learner is guided to secure those competencies both inside and outside the framework of an institution. And at the end of the day, is certified as having achieved that requisite, I use the word knowledge very broadly, requisite knowledge and competencies to go out into the world. We know how to do this. It's the Fielding way. But it requires people who have seen what a Fielding education can do to move it beyond this narrow realm. It requires political and social will, and I address this now to our graduates who know best what the Fielding way is. It requires you. Thank you, and again, my heartfelt thanks for allowing me to share with you today's distinguished graduates the highest honor in meriting a fielding PhD.